Welcome to Instrumental History, a podcast about Jimmie Rodgers' 1928 0045 blue Yodel guitar, which is currently on display at the birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol, Virginia. Often regarded as one of the most iconic instruments of 20th century music, this guitar has a lot of stories, and we've told a lot of stories over the last two episodes. In episode 1, we talked about Jimmie Rodgers' personal history, the history of the Bristol sessions, and how the music industry revolved and evolved around Ralph Peer and Jimmie Rodgers. In episode 2, we spoke to world-famous luthier Wayne Henderson and Martin Guitars archivist and historian Jason Honor about how Martin guitars are constructed and what constitutes a golden era Martin, which Jimmie Rodgers' guitar certainly is. And in this episode, episode 3, we're going to talk about how the effects of what happened here in 1927 in Bristol, Virginia / Tennessee, how that still ripples across music and people today. And we're going to talk to various people that have been influenced by and around this blue Yodel guitar and how Bristol is a comeback story here in the 21st century. So our first guest tonight is Jane Henderson. This is Wayne Henderson's daughter. Now, over 12 years ago, he started showing her how to build guitars, and she has absorbed Wayne's knowledge, and now she is building her own guitar tradition with sustainable materials, and different techniques, while still minding the fact that these traditional building techniques are still make great guitars. So let's spend the first 10 minutes of our show showing how Wayne has passed his knowledge to Jane and what her feelings about guitar building and passing knowledge on to others could be. So let's check in with Jane Henderson right now on Instrumental History.
I've been building guitars and ukuleles. Those are my two that I really enjoy and have taken to. I've been building those for about 12 years now.
Okay.
I think I officially quit working for the environmental nonprofit that I was working for in 2011 and made my business, signed up for taxes and everything.
Right.
2011.
That's a big move, right?
Yeah, I got my federal EIN number. So
right.
I think that's when I officially was like, okay, I'm building, that's my job, I guess, or that's the thing I'm working toward.
Okay.
People want them. I am going to try and make them. So,
excellent.
Yep.
So what are your earliest musical memories, and was it something that was a constant in the household?
Yes. I have never not known music. Both of my parents are extremely musical. The interesting thing is I feel sort of bad about it, but anytime I hear bluegrass music, it makes me so tired because I used to fall asleep in green rooms. It's my cozy spot.
Right.
To be sort of removed from it, but surrounded by it. Fiddler's conventions, Daddy would be out middle of the night. Right. All night, and I'd be just kind of cozied up asleep. And so anytime, especially if it's like a dark room concert, dark in the back and warm and cozy, I cannot. But it's not that I don't love it,
Right.
But yeah, there's been music my whole life, hanging out with Doc Watson didn't seem like a weird thing. So
right.
He's so nice. And, 5-year-old me, give me a hug, honey, give me a hug, So I've never known anything different. I've never,
right.
But I also take it for granted now that I know all of these super talented people
right.
that are so good at what they do. And I can't do that. I don't even try. I cannot.
Well, you're good at what you do, right?
I try to be.
For people who have never had the experience of going to one of these old time, music festivals that are so much part of this area, tell people a little bit about, because you just referenced a great story about growing up in that environment. Tell people a little bit about what those are and why they're so important to this area and why that is your cozy spot.
I think the coolest part about that is you see it's a family. You see it's this gathering of people that you see you always see the same people at the same things, and you spend your time with them, and you get to connect with them and speak this other language that only they speak. And it's
right.
I think that's what makes it really special. That's what I always would look forward to. I know that we go to this one, I get to see these kids, and I can't wait to play with those kids, but I'd say Wayne is the one that has been to far more than I have. I just fell asleep, in the middle of the night.
But it's like a social network before there was social networking.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you said, you see the same people and you get to catch up and you get to find out what's going on with those people. And so, yeah, I guess that sense of community, I guess. Is,
but I think that's something that Jimmie or that anybody, you know, who tried to promote this music, this type of music, especially, I think it's such a community thing. I mean, it started off to share news. Right. You know, like, oh, how do I remember all these news? Oh, let's write a song about it.
Let's write a song about it, right.
And I think that's why people gravitate, or at least around here in this area, so many people played music. Right. I mean, my dad, you know, we went through and he was telling me stories about this cousin and that cousin and dad. And, you know, it's like everybody we knew growing up played music, and they did it at these gatherings. I don't know, because that's what you did. That's where you hung out.
So you touched on this a little bit, and you embrace, you know, traditional building techniques too, but you also promote sustainability. So tell me about the balance between a sustainability for an instrument maker, and what are younger builders doing to kind of promote the sustainability at the end of things? I'm
part of a group in Asheville who are all luthiers. Okay. All boys, but, you know, one thing at a time. Right. But it's so nice that they're younger. Because when they first asked me to be part of it, I was like, I'm not interested. Because usually if I was assumed it was like a 40-year-old dude who's going to be like, now, little lady, let me tell you what. And I get tired of it. And it's like, that's just how, like, all of my dad's friends, they're helping, but they never think that I have anything to say. Right. And the thing I love about this group of guys is they hear me and I get to be part of it. And I think, I don't know specifically what they're doing for sustainability's sake, but I think we all, at least, I mean, we're all in Asheville, so at least I think we're all cognizant of it. Right. And I'm not sure, like, if they do as much as I do with experimenting with oak and ash and maple and walnut. But I think some of them do, and I get to, because they hear me, I get to open that door and say, you know, what are you guys building with? I mean, do you want to? But I think a lot of it, it's going to have to move that way. It's the same as really anything. We're going to have to adapt because there's a finite amount of Brazilian rosewood in the world. You can't. So I think I just wanted to get ahead of it and do my own job, because it's hard, you know, when you start comparing and think like, okay, well, I'm not as good as this one or whatever. Right. So I don't know specifically, but I do know, especially like that group, I know that they're open and willing to try new things, and I like that. But most of them have learned from, you know, an older generation who teaches a specific way. And that's part of it too. I guess the idea of mentoring somebody is really super important. Have you ever mentored anybody else, Wayne? Have you had apprentices over the years, or like?
I guess Jane's the main one. It was be really an apprentice or something. But I had Gerald Anderson worked with me for years, and he learned to be a good instrument maker and went out on his own. And Don Wilson was another one that just, you know, happened to be around the shop quite a bit and helps me do stuff and things like that. And all those guys went out on their own and had a little bit to do with most all of them, but that line of guitars right up there. You know, Jimmie Edmonds and Gerald Anderson and, you know. And
Spencer learned from Gerald, which that's
Spencer,
pretty cool.
That's another generation. Right. Jane's age guy that learned from somebody I taught.
Right. So you're seeing your knowledge already flow down 2 generations of people. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. To have
on the sustainability thing, let's talk about wood and the availability of wood. Do you guys source your wood locally from the region? Or I know you can't get Brazilian rosewood and mahogany and stuff like that, but like top woods and stuff like that, are those available locally? How does that work?
I mean, I do. Personally, there are a couple of places where I know that they source their wood from about 100 miles. Okay. And I try and use them and support them. But yeah, and that's like where I got oak and some really pretty walnut. And they know I'm coming, like they kind of stick the really pretty stuff sort of in the back for me, which is super helpful. But yeah, I think that stuff I can get, and I try to be at least cognizant of where it is. But also so many people of his friends, and I'm getting a lot of people send me messages, hey, my family farm, we had to cut down this cherry tree.
Right.
How can I cut it for you to build me something with it?
Right.
And, things like that. And or they'll just bring in, hey, I was cutting up this piece of oak for firewood, but I saw it's filled with curl. You want it? I'm like, sure.
Yeah.
So we, friends, I think having like a big web of people who know that you would do something cool with it.
Right.
Like he had a friend who had a prized walnut tree, and it made prize walnuts at the fair, right? But it got struck by lightning. They were heartbroken that they had to cut it, or it died, something where they had to cut it, and they brought it up here, and it wasn't big enough for guitars, but I could make ukuleles, and
nice.
And I did. I made a couple really beautiful walnut ukuleles out of their special tree. So things like that, I love the interesting thing is, again, like I was, my dad's telling me these stories about where his guitars came from and what happened with this one. But even before that, there's stories with the wood.
Right.
There's stories with the raw materials, and it's so cool that there is so much history laced within this material.
Right.
And so for me, that's what I usually, I'll have to just walk out to the
shed.
The shed room, because someone has brought Wayne some really pretty walnut oak at whatever we have a guy in in coal country above Abingdon who has insane beautiful spruce that he cuts himself, and maple too, and it comes from right around
really
there. Yeah. And then White Top Mountain, you can talk about that's just my experience.
What a great set of stories from Jane Henderson, and I am so glad that she has decided to absorb the knowledge that her father, Wayne Henderson, has passed along, and as forging her own trail in the world of guitar building. And we show once again that circle remains unbroken as long as the knowledge and the skills are passed down to a new generation of builders. Well, let's switch topics now, and my next guest is a transplant to Bristol, Tennessee from Austin, Texas. He's a radio DJ on Sirius XM Radio. He's on Willie's Roadhouse and Outlaw Country. His name is Dallas Wayne, and I've gotten to know Dallas over the last few years on a professional and personal level, and enjoy spending as much time as I can with Dallas. And he's a great songwriter. So let's talk to Dallas Wayne for a little bit about the craft of songwriting, how somebody like Jimmie Rodgers is really the fountainhead of a lot of country songwriting, and what songwriters can do when they get a little bit jammed up and they need a little inspiration. So let's continue our unbroken circle theory here, showing how Dallas Wayne was attracted to Bristol because of what happened here in 1927.
My name is Dallas Wayne. I'm a singer and songwriter, and I host 2 shows every day, Monday through Friday, on Sirius XM satellite radio, one on Willie's Roadhouse and one in Outlaw Country. And it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming down. Tell us a little bit. You're a pretty recent transplant to the Bristol area, right?
It'll be coming up on 3 years here before
Has it
too
been that
long.
long already?
Been really, it's gone by so fast, and we found a home here. We just love it.
So tell me, where were you at before you came to Bristol?
20 years in Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. And before that, San Francisco.
Right.
Before that, Finland, which is a whole entire other story. And Chicago and Nashville before that.
Okay, so you've been around a little bit. So what drove your decision to relocate to a place like Bristol?
We love the climate of this part of the country. My wife and I both have ancestral roots in this area.
Okay.
I think there's something to that genetic imprint that makes you love the mountains and love this part of the world.
Right.
And I came through here once on tour. It's been 30 plus years ago almost now.
Right.
And always loved this area, loved Bristol. And when I started looking around for a place to relocate, and we hit them all. We hit Nashville, we hit Chattanooga. I didn't want to live in Nashville because I'd done that before.
Right.
And it's better to go into town and do business and then get the hell out.
Right.
that's the best way to do it. Nashville, Chattanooga, the Asheville area, and then we settled on Bristol.
Okay. And did the history of Bristol resonate with you when you were looking for a place, or what was your awareness of what happened in Bristol?
Yes, it did. In fact, I have this fantasy of retirement, just shambling around the archives of the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, just seeing what I can find, 10, 15 years from now when I'm a doddering old man. I'll be able to go in there and spend my days.
So one of the big aspects of the Jimmie Rodgers exhibit that's happening at the Birthplace of Country Music right now, we have the guitar, which is the 1928 0045. We also talk a lot about the songwriting of Jimmie Rodgers too. So is there anything about his music that's influenced you, or anything that you take away from those songs that people are still covering today?
Well, first off, I was so excited when that guitar found a home here. Mm-hmm. But so disappointed that they wouldn't let me take it out of the case and play it. But I got over that. And to your songwriting question, yes, the music that he created is pretty much the foundation of all great country music. There's a direct line between Jimmie Rodgers and Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell to Merle Haggard up to today.
Right.
The music has always been relevant and always will be.
And he even ties back to even older traditions too, like minstrel music and vaudeville music.
Flat out vaudeville stuff, yeah.
And that kind of stuff. In your mind, was he kind of the beginning of, say, honky-tonk music, or even confessional songwriter music? Like, what do you think that he brought to the table that wasn't happening in music before he started, putting his songs out?
Well, the great thing about country music traditionally is it's always drawn from so many other areas and kind of coalesced into one specific sound. And it varies and it changes over the years, the sound morphs onto something else. But Jimmie Rodgers stuff, drawing from vaudeville, like you said, and old jazz stuff, brought a sensibility to a melodic theme to country music, but kept it really simple, which is always the key in country music.
Right.
And I think that he was a big driving force of that. He had a great ear for stuff, and he knew how to make it work for him.
So what is it about the blue yodels, do you think, that really launched his career into the stratosphere?
I think one of the reasons they became so popular was because the solid advent of the 78s.
Right.
And that early recording technology. It was, you can hear a yodeler a mile off. You could darn sure hear it even over the most primitive record players.
Right.
And things like that during the time. And I think that's probably was something. The songs were great. His delivery was great, but that blue yodel is something that's you can smell money every time he does it.
Now, when you started working on the craft of songwriting, and that's what it is, right? It's a craft. It's something, like, some people are born with natural talent, but it's really something you work at. So what are the things, if somebody's aspiring to write songs, what would you tell them to work at? Like, when you're listening to a song, what elements of a song should you listen to? And if you're writing a song, what pieces are important and what pieces are not as important?
First thing I would do is become a student of songwriting if I was them.
Right.
Keep your own individual fire. Don't ever, ever lose that.
Right.
But then go back to the basics.
Right.
Go back to the Jimmie Rodgers, to the Hank Williams, and the Harlan Howards and Hank Cochrans and those kind of folks. Go back to those and take their songs apart and sit there and try to analyze on, oh my God, this was a huge record. This was #1 for 15 weeks.
Right.
Go back and try to understand why.
Why?
And keep the simplicity.
Right.
The old Harlan Howard adage, 3 chords and the truth, is really, it's trite, but it's true.
Right.
As a lot of trite things are.
Right.
But I'd say go back to that and apply it to what you're doing. If you have something you're really strong about and you've maybe not gone through the whole processes of editing it down and analyzing every word and every line and every chorus and every couplet, go in. If it's something you feel strongly about, go in and go with it.
Right.
Because if you studied all these things, then you have a foundation to build on.
Well,
without you even knowing it at the time when you're writing. You're just writing what you feel.
And that leads us to the idea of, collaboration amongst songwriters. Also, as Jimmie Rodgers was working with his sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams, to write songs. Mm-hmm. And you told me a story a while back about a song that you said you had written. And I forget, I think you said you took it to Bill Anderson and he changed like just the position of like 2 lines or something. And you said it just pulled the veil off of the song and made it that much better. Tell me about that.
Exactly. I'd written a song when I was living over in Europe years ago called "He Even Brought Her Flowers," and it was kind of when I was thinking about writing. When I was writing for Warner Chappell, I was trying to write radio hits one after another, just cranking them out. But this was one of those songs. It's like I want to write kind of a bluegrassy thing today, and so I'd written this song. And oddly enough, I might add, in the song is a line about Bristol.
Right.
And at that point, I'd never even been to Bristol. But I thought it was a great poetic name to put in the song, and kind of set the scene of the geographical location of the principles involved in the song.
Right.
So I really liked this song, and I sang it for Buddy Cannon, my producer, because we were looking for stuff for the record. He said, "That's kind of cool," and I said, "Yeah, but it's not. It's missing something. I'm not at all happy with this thing. I was happy with it 20 years ago when I started writing it, but it needs to be done." He said, would it be okay with you if me and Bill Anderson took a crack at cleaning this up? And I learned a valuable lesson. If you ever run into a brick wall as a songwriter, get 2 Hall of Fame songwriters to help you finish it up. Yeah. Sort of like having Hank Aaron and Babe Ruth, in the batting order.
Right.
And so it took half of an evening. I mean, it may have been only 2 or 3 hours before Buddy called me back and he said, "What do you think of this?" And the whole song made sense. All they did was edit it. They didn't add anything lyrically.
Right.
Maybe a word or 2 here and there and changed to kind of sharpen the focus. But they just edited it down. And the song went from 3 or 4 verses to 2.
Right.
And those 2 worked so well. And what those guys know how to do is to keep that basic building block of songwriting. They've honed their craft over the years because they've both written multi-million sellers. Both of them are in the Songwriting Hall of Fame.
Right.
And they honed that down, just distilled it down to its essence.
I want to thank Dallas for stopping by and telling us his story about how, after building a career for years as a songwriter and a performer, him and his wife have chosen Bristol as their home. And a good part of that reason is because of what happened here in 1927. And I think that's very cool. And he also recognized that there's something very cool bubbling under the surface here at Bristol. And that leads us to our next guest. I want to introduce you to Ella Patrick. She's a younger artist, a performer, and a songwriter who calls Bristol her home now. She's from Carthage, which is in North Carolina, but she's moved to Bristol to find opportunities and to kind of bond with the very cool scene that's starting to bubble up under the surface here in Bristol. She works as an associate producer on Radio Bristol and is part of what's going on. So let's check in with Ella and talk to her about her journey as a younger person and why the things that have happened in Bristol in the past are important to her now here in the 21st century.
I'm Ella Patrick, and I am a musician most of the time, but I also am a assistant producer at Radio Bristol. So I cut a lot of audio and do whatever they ask me to do. I do stage management. I write blogs, kind of put the programming together where it needs to be, and yeah.
So you're a Jill of all trades over at the Radio Bristol.
I try to be.
How long have you been working over at Radio Bristol?
So I've been working at Radio Bristol, actually working there for 2 years.
2 years now.
In January, yep.
Wow. And how did you get involved with Radio Bristol first?
I played on the radio.
Yeah?
Yeah. I got an Instagram message from Chris. I don't remember this, but sent in a handwritten letter with some of my music to Radio Bristol, and they asked me to come play on air. And yeah, after I played, Chris asked me if I wanted to do a radio program.
Yeah.
And I'd never done that before, and I was like, sure.
And you still do the radio program today, right?
Still do it today.
Tell us a little bit about the radio program.
So it's called Folk, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty loose examination of American folk music, kind of all aspects of it. I love, deep cuts and kind of looking at outsider artists, but it ties a lot of rural Southern Appalachian folk music to the folk revival of the 1960s.
Okay.
And sort of looking at that genre as sort of a cross-section for the rural South to speak to the more commercial Northeast and academic Northeast. And
right.
Yeah.
So when you're working on your show, how much music is new music and how much of your show is like vintage music?
I'd say the majority of it does come from the late 50s, early 60s, mid 60s, but I do a monthly show where I play all new releases.
Okay. So you do a show entirely devoted to new releases.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
cool.
I do both. And when I do a show, a lot of times I will play older folk musicians, but then also kind of throw in newer musicians I feel like are maybe inspired by, the older musicians.
So one of the things that we talked about before we started recording this was the idea of authenticity. So what makes somebody's music authentic?
Ramblin' Jack Elliott said it's not where you're from, it's where you're going. And I think for me, the hallmark of authenticity isn't necessarily like your genealogy or kind of these ideas that we get into of like, is someone purebred or whatever? But to me, it's hard work.
Right.
And it's someone devoting their life to something. People from the rural South, they weren't even seen as like, it was like lowbrow to record their music,
Right.
Because of kind of how they were. So I think that romanticism on any level, not that it isn't there or it isn't real, but I think that it is dangerous in a lot of ways. This is kind of like the cradle of old time bluegrass music. It is where this music came from.
It's been going on for hundreds of years.
Yeah,
right.
and it's not just a commercial thing. It is a family thing. I grew up playing on the porch, with my uncle and singing with my mom, and I feel like that's very much where this music originates. It's not just a commercial thing. It's a way of life, and it's normal for people to sit around and pick and hang out. And my grandmother and my uncle always tell me, people are a lot less happy now that they don't sing. People used to sing all the time, when they worked, they would sing. So I think there is an interesting thing in this area where, yes, this is a birthplace of country music where it first became commercial, but there's still this tradition here in this region and the greater region of music not necessarily being this commercial thing, but just a part of the way people express themselves.
Right.
And that has kind of held on, and because that, it's a very communal thing.
Right.
And, I'm a child of the brew scene. I know I told you that, and have played in breweries for a long time and kind of grew up when breweries were becoming this huge thing in North Carolina and kind of more rural areas like throughout this region. And I think that has really become, the barber shop of old, where people used to hang out and play checkers and sing the barbershop quartets. It's now the breweries,
right,
where everybody hangs out.
And also, the church has to play something into this musical puzzle too, right?
Sure.
Did you have any experiences singing in church or anything like that when you were younger?
Majorly.
Yeah.
That was a huge part of my growing up, and the first place I ever sang, the only training I ever have is definitely from singing in church and singing with my mother, who is a great alto singer.
Right.
I sang soprano, and my mother's mother, her family were Primitive Baptist.
Okay.
So they, did a lot of the old shape note singing, a cappella type singing. So, but in the church I grew up in, I always sang, and they would give me solos and stuff like that. We also had a bluegrass band that was in our church. I wouldn't have sang a third of much if I didn't grow up like heavily in church singing every Sunday.
Right. So do you think that this region of the country, as rich as the tapestry is talent-wise, you get the feeling that this area is still somewhat kind of under-recognized or underserved in terms of the attention that it gets for its impact? Everybody knows, when you talk about rock and roll, you talk about R&B and gospel music and stuff like that. And do you think that there's still parts of the story that need to be told about what happens and has happened for hundreds of years in this particular part of the country?
100%.
Yeah.
I think, Appalachia in general, I'm making a generalization. One of the reasons it has not been, it's been underserved is geological.
Right.
It's hard to get to the mountains.
Right.
Back in the day when WCYB was playing Farm and Fun Time, it was hard to get those, that radio station, those signals over where the mountains were.
Right.
So it has this isolation element geographically, which has affected people in the region, not just musical wise, but as far as jobs and
socially,
money. And,
right.
And that is a huge, huge thing. Neither here nor there, but my pawpaw's family is very much a part of that. They were coal miners.
Yeah.
In West Virginia and had to leave, and unfortunately he was an orphan. His father died very young, and it's the socioeconomic impacts on Appalachia as a whole, I think, have really allowed it to be underserved and made it so its story is not told in the way that it should be. And we hope, I know that part of the reason I have so much a passion for Radio Bristol is that we hope to shine a light on, how much impact this region really has played in music and culture.
Some great perspective from Ella about the modern day influence of the Bristol Sessions on musicians and what is attracting people to this area now. And, one of the things that could attract you is the fact that this beautiful Jimmie Rodgers 00045 guitar from 1928 is currently on display at the birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol, Virginia. So let's not lose sight of that. But these stories just show how important what they call the big bang of country music is to musicians, But our next guest, Greg Cornett, he tells a whole different story. Now, he's a collector. He's also a musician, but he loves guitars. And he had the opportunity in his lifetime to one time own a Jimmie Rodgers owned guitar. Now, he didn't own the 00045, but he owned another guitar made by a company called Oscar Schmidt. And that Oscar Schmidt guitar is in the collection at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, but it followed a long route to get there. And the story that Greg tells as a collector and the influence that Jimmie Rodgers had on him as a collector is immense, and it's worth sharing this story for every guitar collector out there that thinks that they want to find a holy grail guitar. Well, this one is a great story. So kick back and let's check in with Greg Cornett so he can tell his story about his Oscar Schmidt guitar owned by Jimmie Rodgers.
I'm Greg Cornett from Weber City, Virginia.
And Greg, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a native to the area, and tell us a little bit about your connection to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum.
I was born in this area, have spent my whole life here. Got interested in Jimmie Rodgers and the Carter family probably in my teens, even earlier than that. Let's say back in the 60s. My dad always had some LPs around the house, and being able to mechanically put that music on the turntable and listen to it. And I would hear Carter family, and the geographical link took me a while to figure out. They were really in my backyard. So as the years have gone by, I've gotten more interested in Carter family, and probably Jimmie Rodgers affected how I play and sing, because I do play and sing guitar music and music from this area that interests me. I'm more of an aficionado than an expert, really.
And you've owned some instruments over the course of the years, too. And one of the instruments that you owned in the past is currently in the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. Is that correct?
Yes, that is an Oscar Schmidt instrument that was built in New Jersey, I believe, in early 30s, probably 1930, 31. And it was documented and obviously owned by Jimmie Rodgers. Once he became successful and had money coming in, he liked to spend it. And that guitar was the top of the line for that company at the time. And through a circuitous route, it ended up in the Hank Snow family. And Jimmie Rodgers Snow, is the one who ended up with the guitar out of his father's estate, Hank Snow. And I purchased that instrument directly from Jimmie Rodgers Snow. He used the money for his ministry. He is a Christian minister. And at the time, while I was working, I just had a passion and came across that instrument. And being a Jimmie Rodgers nut of sorts, I purchased that. And it has changed hands a couple of times, and here it is in the museum, and it's just a beautiful piece. My friend Wayne Henderson got it in playing condition. When I had hands on it, it needed some repair work, so I took it up to Wayne. He's a Southwest Virginia resident, obviously, well-known in the area, and we had a great afternoon, and he got that guitar up and playing and strung it up. And to be able to play on that guitar that Jimmie Rodgers played was a moving moment for me.
Wow. Now, do you think that guitar, did he own that guitar prior to the Martin guitar that's in the museum now, or was that after he became successful and that guitar was already built for him?
He purchased that after the Martin guitar. That he had several instruments. He gave away several instruments. He stayed with the Martin guitar that is on display at the BCMA Museum now. He stuck with that from the time he owned it until the time he passed away in 1933. He just liked cool stuff, I guess, kind of like we are. Right. So that guitar that's up in the museum now, the Martin model 00045, he ordered that in 1928. He ordered it in June of 1928, and he only recorded in August of, the earliest he recorded was August of 1927. Mm-hmm. So by 1928, the fourth record of his had been issued, one of them being T for Texas, which was his personal big bang. So he had more money coming in, of course, than he'd ever seen in his life, and he liked to spend it, and he quickly ordered this guitar from Martin in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and he ordered the fanciest guitar that they produced and even ordered fancier ornamentation than they normally provided.
Right.
He wanted his name on it, and he had blue Yodel inlaid on the headstock as well. But point being, once he felt like he had hit it big, he wanted the best of the best. In 1930, Jimmie Rodgers was scheduled to perform a show in Mississippi. And he performed under these big tents with these traveling shows. Many times he attached himself to traveling shows. And I've looked up newspaper accounts, and his name would be listed in advertisements, come and see. And many times he was part of a multi-person performer's bill.
Right.
But he had gained a following very quickly in 2 years. 2.5 years. So he was scheduled to perform, and being, as he was suffering from TB on and off, good days, bad days, he could not perform one night of this show. Well, there was a local boy named Bill Bruner, who was a resident of Mississippi, resident of Meridian, Mississippi, that the managers of the show heard about. Said he's Jimmie Rodgers personified. If Jimmie can't be up here, here's the next best thing. And I have heard a 78 that this Bill Bruner performed on, and he struck, straight Jimmie Rodgers is what he wanted to be and emulate. So he was found, brought to the show, and actually performed at the show, and the word was huge success, and everyone was happy. And apparently Jimmie Rodgers was so happy he gifted him the guitar that he had with him at the time, which was this Oscar Schmidt that's in the BCMA Museum now. And that is... Many stories are hearsay, but this is documented that guitar was placed in the hands of Bill Bruner. I want you to have this guitar. And Jimmie Rodgers signed that guitar and dated that guitar.
Oh, wow.
April 9th, 1930.
Wow.
And I have been able to find documentation that he was performing in that area in 1930. So the Jimmie Rodgers signature is absolutely verified that he owned this guitar. So Bill Bruner then set out as a resident of small-town Mississippi to try to be a performer as well. And he did record a 78 for OK Records, which was issued, but, frankly, never became a noted performer. So he has even written his name, hand-lettered his name on the front of that guitar as well. And he performed, and by, let's say, 1950, he was raising a family and still living in the area and doing what it took to make a living. In 1953, the town of Meridian, Mississippi, had the first Jimmie Rodgers Festival. Mm-hmm. And it's very well documented. Hank Snow was there. Ernest Tubb was there. Jimmie Rodgers' surviving widow, Carrie, was there. It was a major event for Meridian, Mississippi. As part of the ceremonies, Bill Bruner presented this Oscar Schmidt guitar to Hank Snow's son, Jimmie Rodgers Snow. And the idea being that Jimmie Rodgers Snow was going to carry on this legacy of Jimmie Rodgers and all of his musicality and the mood and everything with Jimmie Rodgers Snow was going to continue. So there are photographs of, this guitar being handed over. And what is the most interesting about this story is Jimmie Rodgers Snow became a minister.
Right.
And if you look, it can be found. In 1957, he gave a very famous, he didn't give a speech. As part of his sermon, he was filmed talking about the dangers of rock and roll.
Yep.
And it's a very famous moment.
Right.
It was the Elvis days. So it was obviously newsworthy because the news wanted something to sell.
Right.
So they readily rebroadcast this short portion of this sermon, and maybe not in the most respectful way looking back upon it, but the point being Jimmie Rodgers Snow never became the to carry on the legacy of Jimmie Rodgers.
Right.
So the guitar hung in the den of the Hank Snow family until Hank Snow passed away. So there is a hole in the back of the guitar, straight through the sound hole, where they just bolted it
to the wall.
To the wall. So,
oh man.
So later in life, Jimmie Rodgers Snow kept the guitar, and he was he's probably close to 80 now, at least. So he decided to sell the guitar and use the proceeds for his ministry.
Right.
And it did come up for sale, and that's when I purchased it. But the path of that guitar and the musical story associated with it is fascinating to me.
It is.
And, it's had some pretty cool hands on it.
I want to thank Greg Cornett for stopping by and sharing his story about his Jimmie Rodgers owned Oscar Schmidt guitar, which is also on display at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. And wow, that's kind of like a holy grail for any guitar collector to know the history so intimately about an instrument from basically when it was purchased to where it is right now. And it just shows how Jimmie Rodgers' influence is still rippling through even guitar collectors after almost a century. Well, we're getting close to the end of this whole thing, talking about Jimmie Rodgers' 0045 Blue Yodel guitar. And my last guest I'm going to bring in, he's the program director for WBCM LP Radio Bristol. Chris Trulson's He's been on the ground floor of the Birthplace of Country Music Museum since it started. And I want to bring him in, let people know who he is, why he's in Bristol, and what he's trying to do to push that message of the big bang of country music and even more into the 21st century. So let's wrap up this whole podcast, Instrumental History, by sitting down with Chris Trulson from WBCM LP and finding out a little bit about him and what the future holds for Radio Bristol.
My name is Chris Trulson. I'm the program director of Radio Bristol, which is a community station that's housed in the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. And it's listener supported, and we've got a whole bunch of DJs that are local DJs, kind of highlighting regional music from the past as well as the present, and pretty proud of that station. When did
Radio Bristol go on air?
We went on air in 2015, so we're about 8 years in, and it started out actually as kind of a grassroots crowd-funded campaign where we did a Kickstarter campaign to set it off at first, and had a lot of community support. And since then, it's grown into really what's become a true community station. It's all local voices celebrating a lot of the music that we have around this region.
Now, and you've been with the station since it started?
I have. I actually was on the sort of ground level where before we even knew if it was going to be a station, we were putting together what was going to be an exhibit based around radio, regional radio.
Right.
Talking about the importance of radio in the Bristol area with stations like WCYB. And we were gifted some pretty amazing pieces that eventually we decided to turn into actual working things, like our console. We have this old Raytheon console from 1946 that was actually used at WCYB. And once we were donated that, we decided, why not turn this into a community station and actually make this exhibit not a static exhibit, but an exhibit that is contributing to the community today. So yeah, I started out as an intern in 2014 with Birthplace of Country Music before the museum was open, and then headed up Radio Bristol Project with a few other folks.
You're not from Bristol originally. Where are you from?
I'm from Colorado originally, and I mean I've moved around a whole lot throughout my youth with my parents. Started out in Wisconsin, ended up in Colorado, and then I was in Chicago playing music for about 10 years, where I got really invested into country music.
Okay.
Which Chicago isn't really the place you want to be with if you're like deeply invested into country music.
Well, I mean, Robbie Folks was there.
I mean, there's some great musicians there for sure. And there throughout kind of the 20th century, there's been some really great country artists who have made Chicago their home. When I was there wasn't that much going on, and I really was hell-bent on putting a good band together.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't able to do that in Chicago.
So what brought you to Bristol originally?
I actually ended up finding out about ETSU, which has a country, bluegrass, and old time program.
Okay.
And I found out about it when I was at Bean Blossom in Indiana.
Okay.
This would have been 15 years ago. Somebody told me about that program, and I was like, well, that's something I could be interested in, and it would give me something to do on the side of also being a performer and keep me busy. So I looked into that program, knew all about the history of Bristol, knew all about the history of kind of this whole region as far as country music is concerned, and so went and checked out that program and was intrigued by it, and 3 months later ended up moving to Johnson City, and then quickly really delved into studying the history of country music, where eventually I got my master's degree. I was the first graduate to get my master's at ETSU with focus on the history of country music.
Wow.
And that through grad school was introduced to the Birthplace of Country Music, where I interned.
All of this while you're still being a musician.
Yeah. So I was gigging a lot through all those years, but there was a nice balance there of being able to hit the road and come back to the Tri-Cities area, and we're in such a wonderful location where you can get to so many places in just under a day's time. So the touring here is ideal. But yeah, juggling a lot of stuff, and I'm still juggling all that stuff.
You're still juggling to this day.
Yeah. So it seems to be like my favorite means of operation is like drowning in work.
Right. Yay. It's good for your self-care and your relationships, I'm sure. The importance of Farm and Fun Time is really notable because I think a lot of times when people think of Bristol and the history of country music, like you said, I mean, people think about the Bristol Sessions in 1927, but part of the mission of the museum is to explore the impact of the Bristol Sessions on popular music. And this just shows that impact was still resonating here in Bristol into the when did Farm and Fun Time start? The 40s?
Yeah.
Through the 50s.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's a great way to keep it relevant and keep showing that the impact of what was going on here stayed relevant.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. The notion of the 1927 sessions, I think could feel stagnant, like it's just this moment in time, which it was this amazing, incredible moment in time that captured a lot of music. The thing is that what that sparked is relevant today, and it's been this narrative that continually moves and continually shifts and evolves, and that is a very important aspect of what we need to talk about as the birthplace of country music. It's this idea that country music, it can be many different things, and it continues growing, it continues to change, but always fundamentally at the base of it are these important sessions and a lot of the folks who helped to commercialize country music in the first place. But I mean, we're still feeling the reverberations from that today.
Well, I think that's important too as we talk about modern day Bristol and why you moved here and why I moved here. And do you feel, and I think you already alluded to this a little bit, that this region has something to offer to musicians when you see places like Nashville, Austin, becoming places that are becoming artist unfriendly in terms of like, I can't afford to live there. Yeah. So how does Bristol stack up? What kind of resources do we have for musicians to survive? And you already mentioned it, like you can reach tens of millions of people within a day's drive from this area. So talk a little bit about the resources and why this is a good place for musicians to live.
I mean, that question in itself really excites me. I think you pointing that out, Clint, is really important. The towns like Austin didn't just become Austin. Right. There were artists at the beginning that helped to spark that. Right. And I truly believe that Bristol can be one of those towns on a smaller level, but it can have just as big of an impact. Right. And where we are, in the arts in general these days is a fairly tricky space to navigate as far as career paths. But one of the beautiful things about living where we live is that it's more affordable. We are around a whole lot of amazing artists. We have more artists probably per capita here than you can find in most places as far as musicians are concerned. And of course, we have this tradition that is continuing. So like this to me is like the potential for growth here, as far as music, as far as a contemporary music scene. I think that we have it going on here more so than most places, and with the right ingredients and the right people, it could really happen. And we're seeing it happen. I mean, we're seeing the influence that birthplace of country music and a lot of the people who have invested in downtown Bristol, they see that vision, and we're seeing that growth. So when I moved here 12 years ago, downtown Bristol was pretty desolate. Right. And now downtown Bristol, if you come down here on a Thursday or a Friday, it's popping. It's bumping. Yeah. It really is. And and also there's music to be seen here at all the times of the year, whether it's in Bristol or whether it's the surrounding region. There are so many different organizations that are doing their best to lift the arts. And I think the more that we can partner with a lot of the surrounding organizations, with the artists and all these various things, I just think the potential here is huge. And that's what brought me here. As I saw that right from the get-go, I was like, wow, this is a place where you can be an artist and potentially make a decent living.
Thank you, Chris Truelson, and thanks to everybody that came by or called in to do an interview with Instrumental History. We've spent 3 hours and lots of interviews finding out a lot about the Jimmie Rodgers Blue Yodel 00045, which is on display at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol, Virginia. To find out more about the museum, you can visit www.birthplaceofcountrymusicmuseum.org and plan your trip to Bristol, Virginia/Tennessee. I am Clint Holley. I've been your host for all of these episodes. I want to thank Dave Polster and Harrison Hunt for technical and editing and mastering assistance. I would like to thank Chris Truelson and Josh Littleton from Radio Bristol. and Scotty Almany and Renee Rodgers from the Birthplace of Country Music Museum for collaborating with me and allowing me to spend so much time talking about this wonderful instrument. I'm going to post all of these on a Mixcloud account, and you can follow my Instagram, which is Pressing Matters WBCM, for more information if you missed episodes 1 or 2. So I hope to see you somewhere out there on the radio waves in the near future, possibly on a Thursday night at 6 p.m. for Pressing Matters. And until then, have a great day.